All right. Welcome to the third installment of the 2021-2022 International Leadership Series. My name is Dr. Nicholas Hudson, and I have the privilege and honor of serving as the Director of the Office of Student Orientation, Leadership and Engagement, and in conjunction with the Office of International Engagement, we are pleased to put on this series. And this year, our focus is dignity and justice, fulfilling the human rights promise. This year, our theme revolves around human rights. We base our themes in the International Leadership Series based off of the Oxfam elements of global citizenship. And for those of you who have attended before, this may be a rehash, but we want to make sure everyone understands this concept. We've looked at those 7 different elements of global citizenship as defined by Oxfam. First one we looked at was sustainable development, and that was 2 years ago. Last year we looked at social justice and equity. This year we're looking at human rights. Next year will be on peace and conflict. The year after that, identity and diversity, power and governance, globalization and interdependence. And all of those 7 elements really are what we here at the International U hope our students will have as they end their time as students and enter into the workforce. Many of you here today are International Leadership Fellows or attempting to become an International Leadership Fellow, where you have to attend 5 of the 6 series, as well as complete the prompts. Those prompts will become available on Blackboard within the next 2 to 3 weeks. And then we will also have the Art for Social Change event in spring 2022, of which you will have to participate. A benefit is that you get to be recognized as one of the TAMIU's most prestigious leadership positions here at the institution, as well as be provided a medal for your participation in this program. So as we talk about this year's theme, human rights, we want to make sure that everyone's on the same level playing field as it relates to kind of what is this concept of human rights. And human rights are rights that we have simply because we exist as human beings, right? They are not granted by any state. It just means that we have these rights because we exist as humans. And so some of the overarching elements of human rights are that they're universal and inalienable, meaning that everyone is equally entitled to those human rights. They cannot be taken away unless it's through due process. They are indivisible and interdependent, meaning that you cannot have rights in civil or political without actually also having rights in the economic, social, and cultural aspects of it, right? So when we talk about human rights, that it's kind of overarching amongst other different type of rights that we have. And if you cannot exercise one of those rights, then you have an inability to exercise the rest of them. Finally, they are equal and non-discriminatory, meaning that we are all born free and equal in dignity and rights, and that we have freedom or should have freedom of discrimination to ensure that equality across the board. So today, we are continuing on our conversation as it relates to human rights inside of the Americas, and we're really focusing in on the different elements of human rights violations that may exist inside of there, but also ensuring that we look at the different cultures that exist here. And so we are lucky today to be talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls of Turtle Island and the Pacific Islands. And we have here Asmanahi Antoine, who is the Director of Indigenous Engagement at Royal Roads University in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. And so we are super excited to have them here. Previously, they were the Manager of Indigenous Education and Student Services at Royal Roads University. Asmanahi is a PhD candidate in the Doctor of Philosophy, Educational Theory and Practice program at Simon Fraser University. She has a Master of Education in Psychology and Leadership Studies, specializing in Indigenous Community Counseling, and a Bachelor of Arts in Child and Youth Care with a minor in Indigenous Studies, both from the University of Victoria. Asmanahi has utilized various skills in academic institutions and other nonprofit Indigenous organizations as an Indigenous counselor, family counselor, educational and career advisor. Asmanahi believes her life and work are connected to a strong foundation of Indigenous ways of knowing and being used in the way that she communicates, trains, and facilitates teachings about reconciliation, decolonization, and the history of Indigenous peoples. She continues to walk between two worlds, the Indigenous and non Indigenous, and is recognized for her need to build and sustain a culturally safe place for all. Asmanahi will share stories and life experiences along her academic journey into career opportunities. She has had the privilege of learning from Indigenous scholars, mentors who have become friends, and engaging with national and international Indigenous communities. Of course, along her journey, she has stated it did not come without trial and error using different innovative modalities tied to family values, culture, traditions, and ceremonies. And they have been very active both at a university, provincial, national level, as well as in an international level through the fields that we both share. And is a member of Ashoka Canada, of which Tammy Yu is also a member of Ashoka with our change making projects. As they sit on the Indigenous Advisory Committee for Ashoka Canada. And so, if we could give a virtual round of applause to our guest today, Asmanahi Antoine. And I'm going to go ahead and pull up that next PowerPoint real quick. Here we go. There we go. Lovely.
Thank you, Nicholas, for that great introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm going to give a more personal welcome. So if you go to the next slide, Nicholas, that would be great. So where my feet are planted, where I live, where I work, where I learn is on the traditional lands of Kosopson Esquimalt Nation and Lekwungen Songhees Nation. And I'm grateful to the ancestors and families who continue to support me, welcome me, and guide me professionally, but more importantly, personally. The relationship part is so important to me that every day, every meeting, everywhere I'm at events, it's always starting with that land acknowledgement. Where are your feet planted today? What is the history of the ancestors of those lands? And so, if you, as I'm sharing some of this introduction, I want you to take some time and think about where are your feet planted and where do you come from, and share that in the chat with me today. That would be great. My name, Asmanahai, means caring for precious ones. It's a Nechanic phrase from my late mother, Vera Thompson's family from Toquat Nation of Nechanic lands, which is technically the west coast of Vancouver Island in British Columbia, also Canada. But and then my last name Antoine comes from my late father Eugene Antoine from Saikas Nation from Carrier Secani lands, which is central northern BC. But I've been residing in these traditional lands now for about 25 years. One of the other things that we do is acknowledge the leadership and friendships of each of the nations, and there's many surrounding nations within the Greater Victoria area, but Lekwungen and Kosopson takes up a big mass of the lands that are around. So elected Chief Ron Sam, raise my hands up to him for his leadership and friendship. He's from Lekwungen Songhees Nation, and Hereditary Chief Edward Thomas, and elected Chief Rob Thomas, both from Esquimalt and Kosopson nations as well. I'm going to talk about location here for a minute. So Nicholas, if you go to the next slide, I'd greatly appreciate it. So BC, I'm gonna locate and start off where I'm located. Think about Canada, think about the rest of Turtle Island with a little bit of explanation of location. For me, when I do land acknowledgements and talk about land acknowledgements, it's really starting with the ancestors of the land, starting with your ancestors, and then who are you? Who am I? And one of the things I want to think about as I'm talking is in BC. This is all of the different nations within BC. Well, some of them, not all of them. I think this is the language. And then the little area beside there, the little other thing where it says Georgia Strait and Juan de Fuca, there's the southern tip of Vancouver Island, and down below is Washington, and then over on the mainland is part of Canada. All of that red boundary is what we call Coast Salish, and which is a very colonial terminology. And the colonial terminology for that really encompasses so many different nations within that area. So, for example, in Greater Victoria, we have about 20 different First Nations within that area. And then you move over to the mainland, and there's quite a few over there. And then you hit down in Washington State, there's quite a few nations in there. Now, when talking with elders and old ones, they say, please really refrain and really think about what is the area around you, and not about the borders and boundaries, but really just what is the nations and what is the family relations to each other in those areas. A lot of Coast Salish will have this similar uh, protocol and practices. Uh, they'll have a number of different dialects and languages. They'll have, but a lot of their songs and regalia and all of that is looks very similar. And that's just based on family stories and family relations and all of those things. Going into Victoria, back in the 1850s, they created the Douglas Treaties, the Victoria Fort Treaties. And in those Douglas Fort Treaties, they had talked about all of the different families that were in the area. When I looked at the map, I wanted to know more specifically, and this is that critical thinking that I'm going to ask you to do today. That critical thinking is thinking about what and who created that map for one, what families were in the area, but based on what time of the year, because harvesting back in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, was very prominent on our food source. So recognizing all of those pieces, and then so on that Fort Treaties map, I had stated my guess it was somebody who was non-indigenous, spoke English, didn't know the family traditions, didn't know the time of the year, and didn't know all these, because on that Fort Treaties map, in my opinion, there was a Cowichan name on there down on part of the Saanich Peninsula, and the Cowichan families are actually over the mountain and not in that area. They are Coast Salish, but not in that same area that was on the map. So just things to think about as we're moving forward. One of the things that I want to state is I heard Vizena Gizik, the one who speaks Pictures in the Sky, Senator Murray Sinclair, who also was the chair of our National Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in Canada. In 2015, they wrapped up the Truth and Reconciliation document that had 94 calls to action for building relations and reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. But for me, reconciliation is this idea of practice and valuing humans and valuing people and valuing and moving beyond what we are trying to unlearn, relearn, and re-engage with each other in such spaces. But Mizena Gizik, and if he was on here, I would be asking him, am I saying it right? Because I always want to know, making sure I'm pronouncing things properly. He would ask these four perspective questions, and it was some of his thoughts on his Ojibwe traditional perspectives, his teachings from his heart. Four perspectives I want you to think about today. First question is when I ask yourself, where am I from? So where am I from isn't just when I was born and raised in this small town of Port Alberni on Vancouver Island. I would run into elders, and they would say, "Where are you from?" And I would say, "Port Alberni." And they said, "No, where are you from?" And I would just say, "Port Alberni." And then growing up, I realized and recognized that question actually has to do with who's my mom and who's my dad and who's their parents and who's their parents. So thinking back as far as you can, it's your creation story. What does that mean? So my families originate from Nuu-chah-nulth and Carrier-Secani lands. So thinking about that connection. The second question he gave is, where am I going? Where am I going is not where am I going tomorrow? It's not where am I going in a year? Like, what's our plan? For me, it's when he was talking, he had mentioned it's where are we going? We have all of these beliefs, the creation story, and then he said, what happens when we pass away? What is our value and a belief when we pass away? And I've had conversations with a cousin of mine, and uh, he said, what do you want? And I gave him my plan of what I want to happen with my body after I pass. And it was a cremation story that I wanted. And he said, not me. He said, and he made a really strong point. He said, I want to be buried on our lands, back in our traditional lands. And I said, oh, okay, well, it's good to know. And he said, no, there's a purpose intention of that. That's because that's the whole reason why we fight for our traditional lands. Our ancestors belong to the lands. The animals that are there belong to the lands. There's a cycle that goes on those lands. And I was just like, it's just one of those aha moments. So where am I going? Is that connection to land? How important it is to connect to land. And right now, during the pandemic and everything that's happening over these last couple of years, I've had this strong urge to be back on my homelands, but of course, due to the pandemic, we're not allowed to travel yet. Even going up to my home communities to visit family because they want us to all stay safe, which I'm grateful for. Uh, grateful for. The third question: why am I here? So thinking about yourself, why are you here? What's our purpose and intention? How are you living with purpose, and how are you living with intention? So recognizing that my intention for today is to give some insights to thinking about human rights and thinking about how does this all connect and what are those missing puzzles, and have you thought about ways to thinking about human rights with Indigenous, particularly Indigenous women and girls on Turtle Island, and I'll get onto the idea what Turtle Island is in a minute. And the final question is, who am I? This is such an evolving and transformation that happens throughout our whole entire lives. Originally, my name was, when I was born, my birth mother, Vera, gave me my name Angela, which I don't use. My grandfather at 15, we have ceremony when we change our names. It's because to honor that we are changing throughout our lives. It's that transformation, transition. And so at 15, I became Asmanahai, which means caring for precious ones, and over time it's just become who I am, and I do care for quite a few people, and that's just my nature of how I take care of things. So I want you to think about those four questions as you're going along. It's kind of like that philosophy and recognizing, okay, what are the some things to keep thinking about. Next slide, please, Nicholas. So thinking about for Canada, we are recognized according to the federal government as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. This represents, which is a very colonial, very broad terminology. Eventually, Indigenous came into the terminology. Before it used to be Indian, before it used to be Aboriginal, before it used to be First Peoples, before it used to be First Nations. And so recognizing all of the different terminology and how complex it gets. It's very complex when you're talking about Indigenous people. This is why it's so important to go back to recognizing whose land are you on? Who was there long before colonization began? What does that mean? And then recognizing all of the footprints and all of the stories that belong to the land back in those way back since the time of colonization and before that. So we're not talking about 50 years or 100 years. We're talking about 500, 1,000, 10,000 years before, recognizing that Indigenous people across Turtle Island have existed long before all of us were here. So I wanted to say this because terminology is so important. It's recognizing, okay, what does this all mean when we're talking about First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Native American, and recognizing those are all very colonial terminology. So let's really go down to family names, family nations. Nicholas, next slide, please. So Turtle Island and the Pacific Islands. So for me, recognizing Turtle Island is a terminology that really comes from the East Coast, and it comes with a creation story. And I'm not going to elaborate more on what Turtle Island is, but also just show a sign of respect about recognizing Turtle Island is has come from the Ojibwe Haudenosaunee families, the Haudenosaunee families from the east coast of what we know as the boundaries of what we call Canada. And in that story, it talks about some teachings of there. I also want to include the Pacific Islands because there have been times where I've done presentations, and to be inclusive is really important to me. So recognizing Turtle Island and the Pacific Islands are just as important, and recognizing the magnitude of Indigenous. Where are Indigenous people from, and what are their stories, and what are their values and belief systems that feed into the present day? And so even though I talked about where it's 10,000, 5,000, 100 years ago, I'm also talking about Indigenous people from yesterday when I talk about the past, because it's not that long ago, because the past of yesterday impacts today. And when I talk about the future, I'm talking about tomorrow. The future is starting tomorrow because we don't know what is going to happen, but what we're doing today impacts the future, which is tomorrow, and hopefully a long term. How are we going to um, sustain all of those practices in the future for the next generation? So generations to come, before, during, and then after. It's that 7 generations philosophy and practice. And as I'm talking, please feel free to put any questions or into the chat. I'm more than happy to answer questions as we're moving along. But I want you to make note, look up what is Turtle Island, look at the story of Turtle Island, because it varies amongst Indigenous people. It's the symbol of life and earth. And life and earth is that interconnected. Hishik ish Sawak, we are all connected. It's the Nutonal phrase, Hishik ish Sawak, we are all one. We are connected. There's a purpose and intention of everything and practice. So, Nicholas, next slide, please. Being whole and setting our intentions. So today I want to talk about moving from apathy to empathy, sustaining regenerative innovation motives. I just did a course on reconciliation and regenerative innovation in an environmental management program. And the idea was to talk about, it wasn't just between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. It was very an opportunity to talk about even for vaxxers and anti-vaxxers. It was, let's talk about Black Lives Matter. Let's talk about women rights. Let's talk about a number of different issues here. And how do you reconcile between two different differences? That conciliation is so important. But in order to do that, we had to move out of apathy, because sometimes people just don't understand and they don't feel that's their responsibility. They don't have a personal connection to it, and recognizing there has to be some movement here. How do you get them to move? And it's easy when you start sharing facts and knowledges and information for them to get into empathy. And for them to stay into empathy, they sometimes will drown into sympathy. And as I love this little diagram, because empathetic means let's find that balance between it all, and let's find what this means and how we can work together, and honor our feelings, honor our processes, honor where we're at and where we started. And so sustaining regenerative innovative motives is that idea of finding ways to recognize relationships are so important, and how do we build from that. Nicholas, next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Next slide, I've talked about that being whole. Sorry, I jumped ahead. So in my life is this dichotomy that arises on a regular basis, in the dichotomy between Indigenous and Western ways of practice and being. And in that practice of being, really gets caught up into really what's the right way, what's the wrong way, what's the protocol process in that. Micmac elder Albert Marshall talks about this two-eyed seeing, a guiding principle that is found in the Micmac knowledge that encourages the realization that beneficial outcomes are much more likely in any given situation if we are willing to bring two or more perspectives into play. And I see him type error in there. I will have to fix that. And it's that idea of Hishuk is to walk, we're all one. Hishuk is to walk, we're all one. It means that I am connected to the earth. I'm connected to my family. I'm acknowledging the families and ancestors of the area, but I'm also building relations constantly, even in the organization of Royal Roads University, and making sure that we are working together as a family. And now family, when you define family, doesn't always see eye to eye, doesn't always understand each other. So it's really just trying to navigate some of those tough conversations and have them understand, because when I talk and express an Indigenous lens, I'm not always understood. And when other colleagues talk in their Western lens, I'm not always understanding. So then we're trying to sit and find coffee and really sit together and understand each other through even having that idea of coffee. And I'm having my coffee right now, because overall, when I think about everything that we talk about, everything that when we sit and eat, is that idea of energy going into our bodies and trying to remember that body memory. Nicholas, next slide, please. So Canada, murder and missing Indigenous women and girls. I'm going to talk a little bit about how this ties into different pipelines that are being emerged throughout Canada and the United States. This one, Enbridge line of oil pipeline that's running between Canada and the United States, also involves the Great Lakes. And when I talk about the Great Lakes, because water is such um, an opportunity to protect. So thinking about water reminds me of New Zealand. A few years ago, the third largest river in New Zealand is now has the same rights as human rights. It's still looked at and valued as a human, and because water is so sacred within Indigenous, with well, I want to say within my family, but I want to think about it for everyone. How water is so important. Women are made up of, our bodies are made up of water. You are born out of water. All of these practices is so important, connecting again back to who you are, where do you come from, but also every time I think about and drink water is that opportunity to really bless where that water came from. Where does that water come from and how are we protecting it? Because if we keep going through all of these practices, we're not going to have the same healthy access to water. And in Canada, there is over 30 Indigenous communities across this country that don't have access to clean water in Canada. Meanwhile, they have billions and millions of dollars to build pipelines for oil, which interrupts our Mother Earth, interrupts our not just our water, but our animals and that ecosystem, that ecology, and recognizing how important it is. Nicholas, next slide, please. So pipelines, recently I've been reading about pipelines and the ecocide, which leads to the femicide, which ties into the UN um, conference that just emerged on climate change, and all of the protesters that were there, and then recognizing a lot of social media and a lot of media had picked this up of ecocide, which is femicide, which leads into that. Because when we look at all of these, for example, I'm going to again go back into Canada here. BC and Alberta, British Columbia and Alberta have three pipeline projects that are going on right now. Trans Mountain pipeline, the Coastal GasLink pipeline, and Enbridge 3, which Enbridge 3 has been put on, I think, on halt right now. But I want to talk about the Trans Mountain and the Coastal GasLink for a second. So as you can see, all of the lines that go through the province, these lines go through some traditional territories that belong to Indigenous people. And so Indigenous people who are for protecting Mother Earth, are for protecting waters, are for protecting for the future generations, for tomorrow and forward, and recognizing that when pipelines emerge, that means that there is man camps that emerge, where man camps have been in that area, have increased the number of Indigenous women and girls who either have been violently abused, murdered, or they have gone missing. And BC has one of the highest numbers throughout Canada of murdered and missing Indigenous women from across the country. So 160 cases of murder, missing Aboriginal women and girls. That accounts for almost a third of all cases of missing and murdered women and girls in Canada. So recognizing as I've been learning and reading about man camps, what does that mean? Well, majority of the camps are the employees who work on these different pipelines. And so in one of the classes I taught, there was when we were talking about the man camps and saying how the men were leaving after work and going into town, and then they were luring Indigenous women and Indigenous girls into violent situations. And then all of a sudden, what was happening, and one non-Indigenous woman who was sitting in class had talked about her experience. She said, I actually, worked at one of these camps as a cook, and she said there was one man who said, "Oh, you can't wander around here by yourself." And she said, "Well, okay." She didn't think anything of it, she said. And then once she heard about the facts and the detail about man camps in class, she then understood. She said, I was the only non-Indigenous woman in these man camps. I am now curious to know what happened to the other Indigenous or people of color women that were in the camps. What happened to their safety? Why wasn't anyone looking after their way of thinking? And so when we take a look at, okay, well, let's talk about, when we talk about the individual racism, let's really talk about systemic racism and setting up different processes of these. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to give you some information on how to follow information about murder missing Indigenous women that actually are been protesting and dealing with legality practices that are happening against Indigenous people because they're trying to blockade, because they're trying to protest against these pipelines. Next slide, please. So how is the United States addressing? So Canada, I do need to say Canada is also addressing murder missing Indigenous women. What I've been finding over that's been really interesting. So in Canada in 2016, not that long ago, they did enforce the National Inquiry for Murder Missing Indigenous Women. That was a 3-year process collecting thousands of stories from family members who have lost a loved one or don't know where a loved one is. So recognizing that, and then in 2020, the report came out with over 100 different recommendations on how Canada can improve the process of murder missing Indigenous women. That includes and ties into the federal, provincial, RCMP process as well. But in the United States, this is what I found interesting. So when Obama was running and elected in June 29th in 2001, he met with the North American Leaders Summit. And in the North American Leaders Summit, he had talked about some key initiatives that were happening across Turtle Island, I'm going to say, with other leaders in that moment. And so in the research that they had found and processed, they said the key initiatives found across Canada, United States, and Mexico, Indigenous women and girls face alarmingly high levels of violence and often lack access to justice, healthcare, and social services. It's the same. It's the same. Thinking about those links. How does this all tie together? And even though they said Mexico, I really want to tie it back down into all of Turtle Island, but also the Pacific Islands as well. The magnitude of violence of the United States country was driven by a new report in the National Institute of Justice with simply staggering statistics, found more 84% of Alaskan Native and American Indian women have experienced some form of violence in their lifetimes. 66% experienced psychological, 56 experienced sexual violence, 55 experienced physical violence from an intimate partner, and 49% experienced stalking. And despite the grave need for support and protection of violence, 38% of Alaska Native American Indian females victims were unable to access legal, medical, or other services. And 95 are the report also found that women who report experienced violence in their lifetime, 97% of victims experienced violence by an interracial perpetrator. So in 2000, going back to my notes here, that was in 2010. In 2019, when the Trump administration was there, they created an Operation Lady Justice. And then just recently for United States, so I'm recognizing work has been done. Work has been going on for quite a while, recognizing that the staggering statistics of violence amongst Indigenous women and girls across Turtle Island, there's ties and looking there. So my curiosity when we're talking about politics, and they've been talking to each other for a number of years now, for the past decade, then where is the reports, and why are we still talking about this, and why are we continuing to create some innovative ways to protect Indigenous women and girls break down systemic racism, break down racism and stereotypes overall in general, and do better, because I believe we can do better. And so recognizing all of those pieces. So uh, if you haven't read those yet and you're curious, please go into the into anti-Google. I call Google anti-Google and see and look up a number of these processes. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk for about another 7 minutes. And I think my slides are because I want to leave some time for comments and questions. If that, I had to throw this one in of your Senator Deb Haaland, secretary, because she rocks your mocks. It's Rock Your Mocks. It's really that celebration of Native American Heritage Month, and I've been watching her process in her career, and I just thought it was wonderful. When she got put into office, she dressed in her regalia. She really raises the voice and amplifies the voices of the rights of Indigenous people throughout your country, and I'm really grateful for her leadership. But Rock Your Mocks has been one of those profound movements, which I think is an uplifting movement. That idea. Let's talk about walking on our moccasins. What does that mean? What does that look like? Next slide, please. Amnesty International. Amnesty International had some really great information on their website, and I was grateful to their organization because they talk about a number of different opportunities to understand the injustice and the inequality in education, in social justice, in health, all of those pieces. And so recognizing that this organization that started in 1961 and they're campaigning the human rights, I it's just one thing that I've subscribed to their site and to their newsletter and constantly seeing them on social media and recognizing all of their hard work. And I could not talk about human rights without acknowledging them. Next slide, please. So where are we now? So this idea of decolonization and reclaiming power for indigenous people, and I'm going to just say for all of indigenous people, this idea of colonization that came and impacted, and one of the things recognizing the hundreds and thousands of years of colonization and what does that impact and where are we now, without harping too much on the far past, because recognizing again past was yesterday, and so what was happening yesterday that impacted indigenous people, and now that you know the knowledge for today, what are you going to do about it tomorrow? So the idea for me, and this is Tommy Kisik, who was an Indigenous young boy who was removed from his family in the late 1800s and then put into residential schools and forced into different clothing. And so the idea process is to reverse that and say, no, we need to, like Rock Your Mocks, we need to amplify and recognize regalia as sacred, regalia as everything. So that I had to throw that in. It's one of my favorite slides that I have. Next slide, please, Nicholas. So where do we start? Beginning of June of this year, Canada revealed 250 unmarked graves for children, Indigenous children, by Kamloops Residential School, which is located here in British Columbia. 215, that's the number it started. And the 215 number started, and then that number just keeps growing because all of a sudden, all the different residential schools across Canada have now been searching and looking, and the number now is close to 5,000 unmarked graves of Indigenous children. The unmarked graves of Indigenous children at schools is needs to be recognized. It needs to be there needs to be investigation. There needs to be some solutions. There needs to be some education around it still. So recognizing that not multiple different impacts it has. So 215 kids, 430 parents, 860 grandparents, all of those stories. Where are those stories? That's a lot of families that have been silenced. So where do we start? It's going to anti-Google and really looking at some of those. How can you support? How can you be a better ally? How can you become an ally? How can you continue that process of being an ally? Because ally is a journey. It's not a destination. It's a journey, and it's an ongoing journey. So recognizing that. Next slide, please. I'm like kind of going through this all over the place. I threw this Chief Dan George. He wrote a beautiful speech back when Canada turned 100, and you saw my little eye roll there, 100. So when Canada turned, Chief Dan George, he gave this beautiful speech, and I would like you to take a look at it. But I'm going to read just the first couple of paragraphs of his speech. How long have I known you, O Canada? 100 years? Yes, 100 years. And many, many more. And today you celebrate your 100 years, O Canada. I am sad for all the Indian people throughout the land, for I have known you when our forests were mine, when they gave me meat and my clothing. I have known you in your streams and rivers, where your fish flashed and danced in the sun, where the waters said, come and come eat of my abundance. I have known you in the freedom of the winds, and my spirit, like the winds, once roamed your good lands. And the speech really ties into the idea that countries are changing and evolving so fast that it was impacting indigenous peoples and the view that they had, even not just as humans, but the idea of what it looked like for looking out on their own traditional lands. The fish was diminishing, which meant that the bears couldn't eat, which meant the eagles couldn't eat, which meant the changing and shifting of everything that throughout our ecology. And so that was, he had wrote that in 1967. So of course his 100 years for Canada back into 1867 to 1967. And then I use that speech every time Canada Day comes up in July, because I say not much has changed. It's still that climate change impact. Mother Earth's human rights have been impacted, people's human rights have been impacted, and everything keeps shifting and changing in this climate change within our world. Living on the island right now, because one of the main highways up island has been cut down to one lane both ways, our gas and our food supplies have been running low on Vancouver Island. Gas, especially, people are out of gas. And gas stations are out of gas, they're running empty. And then you look at Vancouver right now, all the floods that are happening, where people can't get really in and out of that area. And we don't know how long it's going to take to fix some of the highways that have been flooded, and um, roads that have been ruined by mudslides in all different areas. Nicholas, next slide, please. So follow to unlearn, relearn, and understand and raise your conscience. These were a number of different follow Instagrams that I am connected to. The Wet'suwet'en Instagram tag there is one of those. Can't see it. Hold on. There. The Wet'suwet'en checkpoint right now. So this is the idea the federal government, I'm saying, and the provincial government don't understand the idea of the history of Indigenous people even within their own country, and the idea of colonization, because they have pinned elected and hereditary chiefs against each other. And what Soden Checkpoint really talks about that in their Instagram, and Yinta Access as well is connected to that as well, but a number of different murder missing Indigenous Instagram handles. So go and have a look at that. Nicholas, next slide, please. Happy Native American Heritage Month. But I also want to recognize May 5th, the National Day of Awareness of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. In Canada, we wear red dresses on that day, but we hang red dresses up in our homes and our outside of our homes, and you'll see red dresses as you drive down the highway in trees. Pacific Islands Heritage Month is in May. National Indigenous Peoples Day in Canada is June 21st. That's a big celebration. National Indigenous Peoples Month in Canada is for the month of June. Orange Shirt Day, National Day of Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, September 30th. We wear orange shirts, and that 2015 with the feather is which was designed by Carrie Newman, who is Kwakwaka'wakw. from Vancouver Island has done a number of different projects on the Truth and Reconciliation, and of course the National Day of Action for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women as well. Nicholas, next slide, please. Questions, comments? I leave these two questions with you and I don't expect you to answer them, but what does reconciliation mean to you? What are you going to commit to in your personal and professional life? And that is my presentation. Really quickly, I just went through a number of different things and there's just, it's so big, and trying to highlight some of the different information throughout Turtle Island and Pacific Island.
So we have a couple of questions here, Asma Nahai. First one's from Alicia. In what ways have these issues regarding femicide, amongst other areas of education, the natural environment, affected Indigenous women and girls, and specifically throughout this pandemic, that we should be aware of?
The idea has been where I'm going to use man camps again. So man camps continued throughout the pandemic. They didn't shut down. They continued the work. The employees would leave and go and do town, and then come back, and then they would then COVID-19 would spread rapidly throughout the towns, and then would impact some great losses due to the pandemic. So recognizing that, for me, when I think about that, I think about when smallpox was around and they were giving blankets to Indigenous people to infect them. They just didn't have the idea. They don't have the conscience to even think about their own impact. It's a very egotistic, selfish way of looking at things, only what their needs and what their wants is. And so they would go and leave camps, and they come back, and then they would inflict COVID-19 on the local nations.
You know, it's unique when we talk about the connection between the economy and the ecology of and the oil pipelines that are taking place. It's very similar to here in the United States, the oil development, and in many ways, some of the human sex trafficking that takes place here in the United States. You would talk about here in South Texas, all the way up through Houston being a very large sex trafficking location that's there. And we just think about that connection, right, between the race and socioeconomic status of a lot of the women that are being kidnapped and taken along these routes. And a lot of those routes follow a lot of those pipelines that exist here. So it's such an interesting concept that I wasn't fully aware of prior to today. And so I'm very much appreciative of that. Next question we have here is from Elvia. Do you have any book recommendations to learn more about this topic?
Yeah, actually, it's not books. It's more about reports. So Auntie Google's really your best friend. But in Canada, there's the Murder and Missing Indigenous Women's Inquiry report. It's quite long. It's quite detailed because there are personal reports. There are personal stories that emerge from families and from victims within that report. So if you're going to read it, then I highly recommend that you are taking care of yourself, that you're reading with somebody, that you're reflecting with somebody, and that you are getting some assistance while you're reading some of those. One of the slides I didn't see on there, and my apologies, I don't, going through all of this, but I did want to loop back to you, Nicholas, and I'll come back to the book recommendations, is that when Biden was elected, he did cancel the Keystone XL pipeline. And when recognizing that was a huge impact, and it impacted Canada as well, and recognizing, okay, what were the implications and what were the intentions of his canceling that pipeline? And then, so reading through that is a recommendation. But one of the others, which the Murder and Missing Indigenous Women and recommendations to learn more, is also looking at cases. So recognizing when you Google missing murdered Indigenous women within the United States or even in Canada, and live cases or unresolved cases, if you're reading those cases and you're recognizing not just what happened, but you're recognizing what was the process. So you'll see the missing gaps of services that were not taking place. So the lack of care and need with from our CNP because they were Indigenous. So they weren't really following through things. So as we know, the big case that happened down the states, and please forgive me, the non-Indigenous woman who went missing, and then there was wide access to media, wide access to information online. It was spread all over the news. Everybody was worried, but the same month, and no disrespect, and Deb Hollins had mentioned that the same month there was an Indigenous woman who went missing, but where were the ads in the media? So where are those highlighted? So the recommendations I have is looking up independent reporters and journalists and recognizing, and again, it's that idea of how are we critically thinking through all of this? How are we taking apart all of the different levels and the different unwrapping that kind of like an onion of what is happening? And the other one that I wanted to mention off of this and recognizing. So one of them, Helen Betty Osborne, who was kidnapped and murdered while walking down a street in Pass, Manitoba, back in 1971. She was born in 1952. That case actually became also a movie as well. What was so frustrating is everybody in that community knew what happened to her, but nobody was talking. And then all of a sudden, many years later, there was an investigator who came in and said, he uncovered the amount of people who remained silent and just turned the other way. And what we're saying is take off the blinders, look forward, understand that this has a huge impact. There was because that case was solved eventually. That's a brilliant way to look at how every case within Turtle Island and the Pacific Islander is actually handled. If no one actually takes a solid look at evidence and solid look in thinking about that care of Indigenous women and girls, because as all women, we are we are sacred humans. We are all sacred humans. And so recognizing the movement for that. The last piece I want to state is migrant farm workers who actually have encountered also sexual harassment, poverty, and modern day slavery. And one of them had raised the awareness, and then they started the coalition of workers and fair food program. And of course, fast food companies, where does your food come from? Where is it harvested, and how are the workers treated? And everyone, fast food workers, McDonald's, Burger King, Subway, Taco Bell, Chipotle, all have signed up for that except for Wendy's. And so if you Google boycott Wendy's, you'll find out more information. So let's talk about, yes, Ashley, I see your question. So um, touch base a bit about more abuse that Indigenous women suffer from. So I'm a survivor. I left out my own personal story. I am a survivor, so I'm going to bring it down to personally. I'm a survivor of emotional, sexual, physical abuse throughout my life. And so, for example, I was in a terrible relationship with an Indigenous. Well, I was in a relationship with an Indigenous man, and he was terrible. And he had a lot of issues himself because of the impacts of colonization, impacts of his own family who went to residential school, who suffered abuse, and it just was this awful cycle to break out of. And he ended up in foster care as I was and grew up in foster care because I was removed from my parents as well as my siblings because the provincial government and the social workers said, as Indigenous people, you can't care for your own kids. You can't care for your own kids. You are Indigenous. You don't have the tools. You don't have the means. So they removed all four of my mom's kids, and we put them into foster care. Except my older sister got to stay with my grandma. That was called the 60 scoop. And so I'm a survivor of that. I went into foster care until I aged out. I was in foster care. I had suffered a number of different sexual abuses throughout my whole, from the time I was, as long as I can remember, from three until I was probably 18. And then when I got into relationships, and so I got into a relationship, and he had threatened to kill me, and I had my two children. I grabbed my two children, got in the car, drove to the police station because he wouldn't leave my house, walked to the police station and said, I need help. there's a man in my house and he won't leave and he's threatening to kill me. And I just need you to go and I need him out of my house. And he laughed at me and he said, I can't imagine all that paperwork you're going to make me do. You're just going to take him back. And I said, because he's threatening my life right now. And he said, he laughed again and he's like, what do you want? He's like, really? I'm going to do this for you? And so I grabbed my kids and I was crying, both my young kids. And I walked out of the police station. He said, well, wait, wait, wait. And I was like, no, unsafe. It's unsafe. And so right then and there, I called my sister and I called family and I said, could you please come? And we got to the house and got him out of the house on our own. But he did come back. He did come back. And then he grabbed a knife and he came at me again. And I just happened to grab the phone. Both my kids were upstairs, grabbed the phone, dialed 911 through the phone and said, I need help. The police officers showed up and they were like, you could have, saved us a lot of work. And why did you stick around? And I was like, I didn't stick around. He showed up at my house and he grabbed a knife and threatened to kill me. I was just in the police station a few days ago saying he was going to threaten to kill me. And you didn't take me seriously. And you're still not going to take me seriously because it's my fault. So recognizing that and then coming out of that. And then, of course, just, fast forward, do a lot of healing, move a lot of pieces. I mean, my personal story goes on, but the resiliency of Indigenous women is strong out there, but it's constantly fighting up against systems. It's the systems that we are struggling to break through some of those barriers. And the next generations are coming in because they don't fully understand, aren't changing policies, aren't changing structures, are still coming in with the same. So it's that ongoing, how do we unlearn, relearn, and create a new way of being together? Yes.
Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to do multiple screens here at once. But so on our screen here, we do have Asma Nahai's contact information. We are at the close of our session today, and so I do want to thank you very much for really bringing to our institution this one, your story. I think, especially leaving that towards the end, really kind of adds more depth to the experience of Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas and really throughout the world, where we don't often have the platforms to hear them in if we're not there. And so I'm appreciative of you sharing your story. I'm appreciative of you sharing the story of these other missing and murdered Indigenous women and children throughout the United States and the Americas is how I look at it, because I think a lot of it happens throughout I think there's a larger connection, right? Especially here in Mexico, on the U.S. Mexico border, and the as I'm really making this connection between sex trafficking that exists here, where there are a lot of missing women, and where there are murdered individuals that take place throughout here. I'm really just making these connections throughout that.
Alaska, Canada, down the States, Mexico, and then South Americas, right? There's that huge connection. They're all connected, and it's really thinking about, where does your food come from? Where does your water come from? What did it take? And they talk about even products and recognizing, where are all these things coming from? So I wish I had more time with you to share more information, and I hope I can come back and do that. But thank you so much for the invitation. It was a pleasure to sit with all of you in circle, and I raise my hands and say Kleko, Kleko. Thank you.
Thank you all once again. And so we are going to finish recording here. Have a great rest of the fall semester, folks, and enjoy. And we'll see each other again in February, where we'll be talking about human rights through immigration. And so we're going to look at some of the immigration policies that are here in the border area. And so we look at forward to that. All right, folks, thank you.